Once upon a time, everything you needed to know about Magic the Gathering existed in one tiny little book. Look at how small this is. And you know what? Even included a story. Greetings, owners of fine luxury cardboard rectangles. We are here today to talk about Magic the Gathering's first ever story. The very beginning of lore. Now, I feel like I need to explain a few things. One, actually, just so you know, this is a revised rule booklet. So the alpha rule booklet would have been roughly like the same dimensions and everything. However, it wouldn't have a picture of a Shivan dragon here on the front. I'll put it up on the screen, what actually was used as the cover for these little books. You can see on it, it's got the bog wraith. It gives it a very dark vibe. I think that putting the dragon on the front was actually a smart move when they changed it. But overall, the bog wraith does evoke a certain mood. So what we're going to be talking about here, my friends, is this tiny little story that came in the book. Now, I feel like there's some information that you need because unlike the lore that I do normally, you know, following, for example, right now I'm doing stuff about Karn and Joyra and all that. Unlike those situations, this was when Magic was brand new and there was no intention to have a big kind of backstory. Funnily enough, Urza's name is going to come up in this story, but Urza didn't really exist then. Nothing in this can be taken as canon. Essentially, this story is told using the old school perception of like, you and I are a planeswalker duking it out. So you have to set aside, if you're used to like, we're following Jace and all these things, that's not how this operates. This is just straight up two planeswalkers of the old style when Magic originally started. What we're gonna do is I'm gonna go through the story. It's pretty short. It's only maybe like 8 paragraphs long. It's cute though, I like it. It's got its own quaint flavor. And after we go through the story, I'm gonna come back and we're gonna talk about the different cards that are actually represented in the story. Because I like this. This is old school. If you're old school like me, you're gonna enjoy this. And considering the way that things feel overall with a lot of unhappy people in Magic right now, joy is what I'm looking for. So we have the story here of Wurzel. Wurzel is the individual that this story is going to be told from the viewpoint of. Okay? So, Wurzel felt the telltale prickling at the back of her neck. Her domain was being challenged. It's someone old, she thought. Someone I know. Thomal! It had been a long time since he had challenged her. Quickly, she called her vassals into action. She would need much mana for this duel. Much indeed. The last time Wurzel fought with Thomal, he had focused on the destructive magic of the mountains. It had been a close fight. She still saw in her nightmares the brigades of fire breathers that had pushed her to the brink of submission. Since then, Wurzel had learned from a specialist in white magic that there were ways to protect herself from the raw force Thomal loved. Unfortunately, the white magician had been unwilling to part with the knowledge in exchange for her offered artifact. She had been forced to coerce it out of him in another, more violent way. It took a while, but she was a far more experienced duelist than he, and in time, he was forced to yield what she sought. Wurzel soon found that gathering the proper mana for her protective spells was going to be difficult. She needed the mana of the countryside, and disturbances in the ether were preventing her from making the necessary psychic bonds to any of those lands. She had precious little to draw on in the first place. So it could take a while before she managed to get a link to the plains. Just having the knowledge to protect yourself isn't enough, she thought. Well, let's see if I can't stall him with my friends of the forest in the meantime. Wurzel resisted the temptation to invest herself in blue magic in case the rumor that Thomal had taken to raising serpents had any truth. Now she began to regret the loss of the glasses of Urza, which might have given her some clue where the focus of his attack would be. Thomal countered her creatures with a legion of undead. Black magic, she thought. Thomal! I wouldn't have expected that from you. Thomal had always enjoyed displays of pure power, but she had regarded him as a relatively clean fighter. At least, cleaner than most. A sudden sense of horror came over Warzel as she felt a large drain on the mana plane. An enormous drain, accompanied by a stink of sulfur and the grave. Something big was coming. Learned some new tricks since we last met, eh? Muttered Warzel under her breath. Well, so have I, dear Thommel. So have I. It was going to be a tough fight. So that's the entirety of the actual story. It's just obviously a tight little fun, hey, this is what's going on, but you can tie it in to Magic cards specifically that are being referenced. And I did use some of the artwork in the background while I went through the story, but I thought it would be cool to go back through the story and talk about the different points where they're referencing different cards. All right, so I'm just gonna, this is short enough that I'm just gonna read it again and we'll talk about the cards as we get to them. Warzel felt the telltale prickling at the back of her neck. Her domain was being challenged. It's someone old, she thought. Someone I know. Thommel. It had been a long time since he had challenged her. Quickly, she called her vassals into action. She would need much mana for this duel. Much indeed. So, first of all, this is interesting because it gives the idea that planeswalkers can feel the presence of other planeswalkers, like there's a sort of magical signature almost to them, and she could feel that this presence to her was old and was able to pinpoint it to a particular planeswalker. I enjoy that. I find that particular concept flavorful. The idea of like starting to call their vassals into action, needing mana for the duel. I actually like the way they address that later on in the story as well. The last time Warzel fought with Thommel, he had focused on the destructive magic of the mountains. So in Alpha, there's 4 different cards that could be, and you could just combine them all together. So you have Disintegrate, Earthquake, Fireball, and Lightning Bolt. Disintegrate and Fireball are your X-style burn spells where you do X damage to any target. Earthquake is a brutal hit all the players and all the non-flying creatures. I always really liked the flavor of Earthquake because it just felt so right. The more mana you put into it, the bigger the Earthquake gets, the more it affects everybody. And non-flyers aren't affected, which feels proper too. The whole thing ties together as some really great card design. So you have Earthquake, Fireball, and Disintegrate, which are all your X-style red damage spells. And you have Lightning Bolt, which, funnily enough, earlier today, I just went into detail talking about a number of different variants of Lightning Bolt. So if you want to see some interesting Lightning Bolt artwork, check out that earlier video. So that covers the destructive magic of the mountains, roughly. There are other spells, but I'm sticking specifically to burn spells because the way that she talks about protecting herself basically says to me that that's what we're dealing with here. All right, so it continues. It had been a close fight. She still saw in her nightmares the brigade of fire breathers that had pushed her to the brink of submission. And obviously there's straight up an enchantment in Alpha called fire breathing, where you just spend 1 red mana to give +1/+0. It's a very straightforward concept as a card. One of the advantages, obviously, the original designers of the set had was that nothing had been done before. So you could just be like, what's fire breathing? Okay, put a fire breathing dragon on the card, pump it up with fire mana, with red mana, I should say. That makes perfect sense. That works quite well. Okay, story continues. Since then, Warzel had learned from a specialist in white magic that there were ways to protect herself from the raw force Thommel loved. And again, the fact that it says raw force, that's what leads me to think of these burn spells. Now, the white protection magic that I believe is being referenced here would be circles of protection, as they are the most potent protective magic specifically keyed to stopping different colors. There are cards in Alpha that would prevent damage, but they're not tied into particular colors, where all of the circle protections, there's 1 for every color, they all are enchantments that cost 1 white and 1 to put out, 1 mana to activate, and they will prevent all damage to you from 1 source of that color. So they are obviously the perfect answer to things like Disintegrate, Fireball, all that, because those are one-shot uses. So it's basically like you're countering out an entire spell with 1 mana. So that part seems to me like Warzel has gone ahead and learned about circles of protection from the unfortunate white magician that had been unwilling to part with the knowledge in exchange for her offered artifact. Now, there's no clue as to what kind of artifact she might have offered here. So it says she had been forced to coerce it out of him in other more violent ways. It took a while, but she was a far more experienced duelist than he, and in time he was forced to yield what she sought. This actually, to me, ties into the old anti-concept of Magic the Gathering, where we used to play for each other's cards. So the idea is that basically you get into a fight and it's like, you're going to give me the Circle of Protection magic. No, I don't want to give it to you. It's like, okay, we're going to duel then, and I'm going to take it from you by force. That does genuinely feel like old school Magic, and somewhat acknowledging the anti-mechanic that went with the game in the beginning. It's wild to think that we used to actually play for each other's cards. In these days now, where like people consider Magic an investment and double and triple sleeves and are afraid of even like I've heard of a finger dent in a foil ruining friendships. That's the level we're at with Magic cards. I just think back to when I was a kid and we used to play with our Lotuses and stuff like that without sleeves, just scratching them up on the table, playing for each other's cards. It was a completely different time, my friends. I do enjoy these journeys into the magical past, because for me, like, I lived through this. It's not just a look at this in the museum. It's like, remember existing in this. And it makes me really happy. I really loved the Circles of Protection specifically. I remember going out of my way to get a full play set of all of them as rapidly as possible. I thought they were more busted than they were, though, because my friend used a Circle of Protection to stop me from stone raining his land, and I didn't read the card until I had circles of my own and went, wait a minute, this only stops damage, you cheater! Anyways, to continue on with the story, Wurzel soon found that gathering the proper mana for her protective spells was going to be difficult. She needed the mana of the countryside, and disturbances in the ether were preventing her from making the necessary psychic bonds to any of those lands. She had precious little to draw on in the first place. So this is interesting. The way that I interpret this, obviously we're talking about basic planes here, right? So the way that I view this is that, first of all, Wurzel doesn't own that many planes. Like, when we started playing Magic, you didn't have access to infinite amounts of land. Stores didn't have big boxes of land. You didn't get lands in bundles. You got a random smattering of lands with your initial starter deck, and then you would have to trade for lands off your buddy and stuff. So even making connections to lands and stuff like that felt more difficult. And it does kind of feel more like a planeswalker's journey to go and bond with different lands when lands are more difficult to acquire. So Wurzel doesn't have enough planes, and it's interesting that they're showing the way that, oh, why do you have to draw lands and then bond with them, and why do you have access to mana sometimes and not other times? That is attributed to disturbances in the ether in this case, which is actually a really cool concept. So she doesn't have many planes, and she hasn't drawn them yet, is what's going on in terms of the game mechanics there. Now the story continues. So it could take a while before she managed to get a link to the planes. Just having the knowledge to protect yourself is not enough, that she thought. Well, let's see if I can't stall him with my friends of the forest in the meantime. So this obviously means the good old boys like grizzly bears and crawworms. My bread and butter from back when I played. Dude, I loved crawworm. Big old 6'4" beefcake body, and he was common, so I could get a bunch of copies of him. He wasn't difficult to track down. I only had one Force of Nature, but I had all kinds of crawworms. Before we knew you could only play with 4 copies of a card, I used to play 18 crawworms, and I had 6 Sol Rings or something. It was like a really dumb amount of Sol Rings where I could put a crawworm out on the second turn a lot of the time. It's busted to think about how I had so much accelerated mana and just used it for something so janky. And it's like, now that I've accelerated massively, check out my vanilla 6'4". Oh, these memories are fantastic. Wurzel resisted the temptation to invest herself in blue magic. So she's not going to link with any islands here specifically. That's what this is referencing. She's not going to put islands into play, in case the rumor that Thaumal had taken to raising serpents had any truth. Now, the reason for this, the whole mentality behind this, is the sea serpent from Alpha is a big, beefy glue creature. Blue creature. It's a 5/5 serpent, but the thing is, you as the controller of it have to have an island out or it goes to the graveyard. And for it to attack, your opponent has to have an island, because Magic used to have more restrictions. Now, it feels very flavorful. Obviously, if you don't have an island, your sea serpent doesn't have anywhere to live. And if he doesn't have an island, how can it attack him? But, I mean, if they kept that kind of logic, then blue would have a lot of janky creatures because they'd all have to be under the sea, Little Mermaid style. So this is something they don't do anymore in Magic. But back in the day, putting out an island so that a sea serpent could come and slam on you is not what you want to have going on. So Wurzel has heard a rumor somehow through the grapevine of I assume you'd want to keep tabs on fellow planeswalkers to learn things. So she's learned that Thaumal might just be raising serpents, and the last thing she wants to do is raise up access through a body of water for the serpent to get at her. So she says, next the story says, now she began to regret the loss of the glasses of Urza. Now, glasses of Urza, it makes sense why she would regret missing those. It says they might have given her some clue as to where the focus of his attack, give her a clue where the focus of the attack would be. Because glasses of Urza are an artifact, tap them, look at your opponent's hand, right? So you're going to get exact knowledge of what he has, which is clearly quite useful. I mean, obviously this card is not very good. I remember playing with it because I liked the information about my opponent's hand, but overall, what you get from it all on its own, it's just not good enough. But it's interesting to note that they were called the Glasses of Urza, but at this point, as far as I understand, when Magic was originally concepted, there was no Urza and Mishra, there was no Brothers War. Glasses of Urza, like Urza was just a made-up planeswalker name, the same way that Wurzel was, and the same way that Thaumal was for this story. They just made up some planeswalker names so they could attribute these items to them. Maybe not even necessarily planeswalkers. They just created names so they could attribute these items to particular individuals. But Urza didn't exist as a concept, but when the Glasses of Urza did, which sounds really weird, but that's the way it worked. Magic didn't originally have a cohesive story. So don't think that this actually has any connection to Urza the Planeswalker. It has zero connection, this story. There is no connection. But it is still neat to see. So, Thaumal countered her creatures with a legion of undead. So for me, that's Scathe zombies. Your good old 2/2, just generic, here we come, endless legions of the dead. Black magic, she thought. Thaumal, I wouldn't have expected that from you. Thaumal had always enjoyed displays of pure power, but she had regarded him as a relatively clean fighter, at least cleaner than most. It's interesting to think that Wurzel is going, like, condemning him, but at the same time, she basically, like bludgeoned somebody into giving her the magic she wanted. So, levels of morality among planeswalkers is questionable, I would say. That's how I would view that. So, a sudden sense of horror came over Wurzel as she felt a large drain on the mana plane. And that's an interesting concept right there. The idea of a planeswalker actually being able to feel the amount of mana that's being focused into a spell. Now, the idea of a mana plane, whatever that is, I've never seen that referenced anywhere but here. I'm guessing that's just almost like having a level of extra sensory perception where you can see another like plane of existence to a degree where that's inhabited by mana. It's a weird concept. It's a rough way of saying that you have the ability to tell how much mana your opponent is expending. I like that. And then so this enormous drain of mana is accompanied by a stink of sulfur and the grave. Something big was coming. The only thing that I can think of when it comes to a massive drain of mana from Alpha that would fit into the concept of a stink of sulfur in the grave would be Lord of the Pit. And imagine that. You've got a planeswalker who's making pacts with like demons, able to summon these devils from the pits, man. That is really, really crazy. So the story finishes off with, learned some new tricks since we last met, eh? Muttered Wurzel, under her breath. Well, so have I, dear Thaumal. So have I. It was going to be a tough fight. I mean, if you see a Lord of the Pit hit the table and you're not giving up, that means you got some crazy fight in you. So anyways, my friends, I thought this would be a fun journey back into Magic's original story. Let me know if you like this style of video, because this is a little bit different than what I've done in some ways, but I like the vibe of it. So, big shout out to my patrons and channel members. This is a community-funded channel, so if you like what I'm doing and want to support the good times, jump on my Patreon. It makes a big difference to me. So, thanks for coming by, everybody, and I will see you all very soon.